This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger Zakheim and Rachel Hoff discuss the findings of the Reagan National Defense Survey, highlighting the American public's views on foreign policy, military spending, and trust in institutions. They explore the increasing desire for U.S. engagement on the global stage, the decline in trust towards the military, and the public's perception of allies and adversaries, particularly in relation to China and Iran. The discussion emphasizes the importance of understanding public opinion in shaping national security policy and the nuances that exist within it.
Rachel Hoff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Roger. Great to be here.
Well, as all our listeners and viewers know, you are the policy director here at the Reagan Institute. You are a sometimes host of the Reaganism podcast, but this is your first time, as far as I'm aware, of being a guest on the show.
It is. It's an honor and a privilege to reconnect with our audience in this different format.
There we go. That's nice. We're here today, Rachel, because in your capacity as policy director, you oversee our Center for Peace Through Strength. And there's a variety of things, many things that you do as policy director, particularly the Center for Peace Through Strength. But one we're going to focus on today is the Reagan National Defense Survey. I'll hold it up for our viewers. You can go online to the Reagan Institute website and put in Reagan National Defense Survey, or just put that into your web browser, and you can see what I just held up. This has become a very important product for the Reagan Institute, more broadly for the foreign policy, national defense, national security community, because, and I'll say this immodestly, it is the most comprehensive, in-depth look into the views of the American people as it relates to those issues facing Americans in the domain of foreign policy, national security, and defense. And before we jump in to the latest results of the survey, and of course, that's what we're going to talk about for the next 25, 30 minutes or so, Rachel, just give a little background for viewers and listeners, what the Reagan National Defense Survey is, how you go about it, frequency, and all the trimmings here, what makes this thing, again, immodestly here, so important and significant.
Sure. So our survey is a nationwide public opinion poll that asks the American people, actually twice a year now, we're doing this polling work, asks the American people what they believe about a variety of foreign policy, national defense, national security issues. And I think you're right to point out that it's a little bit unique in the space, in that we really drill down, not sort of just where does defense or national security issues rank on your list of priorities alongside healthcare or education or anything else, but really go in the weeds, to the degree to which is relevant and interesting both to the American people and to policymakers. Global headlines, hotspots around the world, issues pressing before Congress and the administration. The way that we do it is we work with a bipartisan pair of polling firms. We kind of work with them on the interesting topics and questions we're interested in learning about. They craft the survey instrument, and then we go into the field, as they say, with the poll. Typically in the fall, just after the elections. This most recent survey, of course, is very interesting because it went in the field just after the 2024 presidential election. Our pollsters talked to over 2,000 Americans, and the sample size is appropriately weighted so that we can really say that our survey results reflect the American population.
And just to interrupt, Rachel, but the 2,000, for those who perhaps are not steeped in surveys and polling and what is an impressive or perhaps unimpressive sample size, 2,000 is like really good, right? I mean, this is actually, from statistically speaking, from what else is out there, this is pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, our polls. About 2,500, I guess more specifically, as we drill down. We do a mix of online polling and telephone polling. Phones is a mix between landlines and cell phones, so we're really kind of reaching people where they are. And to your point there, Roger, you see a lot of surveys that are half this size. Turns out, as long as you're talking to a statistically significant sample of the American people and kind of weighting it appropriately, which of course these polling firms are expert at doing, we're really able to make sure we're getting that representative sample. And the whole point of that is to be able to say, when we see these results, 75% of Americans believe X or 50% of Americans believe Y.
And you're a veteran of think tanks, of Capitol Hill. We have always in our kind of professional lives heard particularly political leaders, elected officials talk about the views of the American people. And oftentimes that is simply the view of one person. And this survey truly tries to capture what the American people believe on these on these issues. We're going to get into some of those details in a moment. But let's talk about the competition here for a second, kind of laying out the landscape. There are others out there that do this. Gallup, right? But it's not as comprehensive, perhaps. You can comment on that. Or the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. They do a survey. Kind of where do we fit in the landscape of the world of surveys, looking at some of these issues?
Well, you're right to point out that there are other surveys out here that are doing polling work maybe much more often in the case of Gallup or sort of touching on similar issues like the Chicago poll. I don't think of them as competitors. I think of them, just as we're kind of a network of people interested in these issues, interested in knowing what the American people believe. And one thing that I think is unique about the Reagan Institute's polling and our survey work is that we're really able to go kind of beyond the top line or kind of the surface level questions on any given topic and really get down. We even, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, we even play around with some message testing, not just what you believe about X, Y, or Z topic around the world, but if you knew this, would it make you more or less likely to support that? And so we're able to really get into a lot of the nuance and color because our poll is exclusively focused on this set of issues that some other polls maybe might not be able to have the time or space to.
Yeah, it's a lot of questions. We asked 2,500 adults in almost all of these questions or many of these questions, and certainly about half that sample size we'll get all of them, so it's pretty comprehensive. Let's get into it. Give us the headlines, Rachel. What were some of the biggest takeaways from this year's or the November 2024, right after election, as you mentioned, Reagan National Defense Survey?
Yeah, I'll mention a couple of things that are most interesting from this year's data, and particularly, again, given the timing just after the elections, as we are in this season of political transition in Washington. We were really interested to note a couple of things. Number one, the American people want more U.S. engagement in the world. They want U.S. leadership on the global stage. It's actually a increasing majority, up 15 points just from our last survey a couple months ago. Up 15 points, the number of people who want to see an engaged U.S. leadership role when it comes to international events. And that's on a bipartisan basis. So that's something that maybe listeners wouldn't necessarily anticipate or expect either, that both Republicans and Democrats, Americans who voted for Vice President Harris and Americans who voted for President Trump, want to see that U.S. leadership role in the world. It's actually a little bit higher among Trump voters than it was for Harris voters. They want to see America leading on the global stage, doing so from a position of strength. That's another thing that comes through in this poll, is the desire to have U.S. leadership really undergirded by a strong U.S. military. And maybe a final point, in defense of our values, universal values of freedom and democracy and human dignity and human liberty around the world. Some of those things are consistent in our polling over time. We've been doing this for several years now, so we're starting to look at some of those trend lines, and some of those things are some of the public opinion trends are moving.
Yeah, staying in the crosshairs a little bit, you gave us some color how it divides across Republicans and Democrats, Harris voters and Trump voters, and certainly for those inside the Beltway in Washington, hear a lot about how Republicans, Trump voters are more isolationist That seems not to be the case, at least if you think being isolationist would cut against America leading the world, which to me seems intuitive. So clearly it's surprising and jumping, as you note, 15 points. What about the 18 to 30 demographic? Because that also was at least surprising to me.
Yeah, that's right. The increase in the percentage of Americans who want to see a more engaged and a more engaged America, a more leadership role on the international stage is really being driven by those younger Americans, those in the 18 to 30 demographic that you mentioned.
So what about the skeptics, Rachel Hoff? You say, okay, well, this is the Reagan Institute, Reagan National Defense Survey. I'm sure they're asking this question, so there's only one right answer, and you're leading the witness, as it were. I mean, what's our defense to those who want to be skeptical of the outcome here, which, of course, is entirely complementary to the namesake of the Institute, which, where you and I work?
Well, it's an important critique to take on, and actually we've got the data to back up. This isn't that type of survey. We're not calling Americans and saying, "Oh, do you think Ronald Reagan was a great president or the greatest president ever?" Like we're really structuring the questions in a way that get at the nuance of public opinion around these important issues, and frankly, allowing the American people to tell us that they, we don't frame it this way, but some of the results we've gotten over the years really are at odds or contentious with President Reagan's legacy. I think at the broadest level, and some of those takeaways that I just shared, there's a lot of alignment with President Reagan's legacy, but we've seen some sort of outlying issues over the years where it cuts the other way. And frankly, Roger, for you and I in our work, and certainly as we brief out this survey with policymakers here in Washington, it's also really important to know when the American people disagree with a particular foreign policy stance or worldview that you might take. But we work with a bipartisan pair of professional polling firms for that reason, to make sure that our survey is structured in a way where it's an honest take.
Yeah, geographically dispersed, demographically dispersed, across the board, obviously politically dispersed as well. You mentioned areas where perhaps it doesn't line up with where you would think a Reagan value would go. We'll talk about Ukraine. Certainly, President Reagan was one who always sought to support those seeking freedom and wants to make sure those whose freedom was under threat, he was backing and supporting. Ukraine is perhaps one of those cases where certainly those who are voting Republican, voting for President Trump, it's not decisive that way, and we'll get into that in just a minute. It's pretty much a divide, a fissure amongst conservatives. But another area where there was an outcome result that we've seen over the number of years since we've been doing this survey, since 2018, November 2018, it was the first Reagan National Defense Survey, is confidence in our institutions, and specifically the military. And here, I think all Americans would, certainly many Americans would want to have trust and confidence in their military. But we've seen since 2018 a real precipitous decline in the trust and confidence American people have in the military. Talk about that just for a minute.
That's right. And this is a great example of a data point and a trend line that's come out of the survey that we as an organization have looked at and said, hey, this is a real problem. When we started doing this polling in 2018, as you mentioned, 70% of Americans said they had a great deal of trust and confidence in the American military. At the lead across all of the institutions that we poll in terms of institutional confidence, and certainly a really strong majority there reporting the highest level of confidence in the American military. In just a handful of years, 3 or 4 years, that number had decreased 25 points. Then less than 50% of the American people, 45% of Americans reporting a great deal of confidence in the American military by just around 2021. And that's something that, we did a lot even within the survey to figure out why, right? So it's one thing to
that's something we get that a lot, right? So when a person finds something interesting out of our survey or disappointing, rarely if they like it. If a survey outcome kind of aligns with individual's point of view, it was kind of like, oh, of course, that's the right point of view. Why would anybody take it? Then there's really no kind of, the curiosity somehow is not present. But if there's a point of view, the survey shows something that really you disagree with, then well, why is that happening? And that happened a lot. We got, I remember you and I took meetings with senior military leadership. And the question was, did you ask why? And we were like, well, that's kind of for you to understand, in your own survey. So what do we do kind of to follow up on that?
Yeah, so over the course of multiple years in our survey work, we took those why questions and put them back to the American people. We even have the ability in our survey to ask open-ended questions where respondents are not just, saying, oh, did they say yes or no or more or less, but just kind of short answer type questions where then the pollster's job is to categorize and bucket them into different kinds of responses. And when we asked why people were losing confidence in the American military, the response that really rose to the top, that was driving nearly all of the loss of confidence, was around the politicization of the U.S. military as an institution. And that's something certainly that we've seen driving quite a few headlines over recent years, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, with leaders and the American people from both the right and the left coming at the military with some critiques in that kind of political realm.
And it's probably worth mentioning that as poorly as the military has performed in terms of maintaining and then losing the trust of the American people, trust and confidence of American people, compared to other institutions, they're doing quite well. So compared to the presidency, whereas 22%, compared to the 50, and we should note that in this year's survey, it's kind of, we're seeing it kind of tick back up ever so slightly from the nadir of November 2021, as you pointed out, 45%. In November 2024 is 51% with a great deal of confidence. In the military, or some confidence. Presidency's at 22%. Congress had a great year this year. They ticked up to 9% off of 5% from the previous year. The highest they've ever scored was in February 2021. When they reached double digits at 10%. That perhaps is not surprising to our listeners and viewers. You love your individual congressman, but you hate the Congress dynamic. Certainly playing out here. Supreme Court has really gone down, but it was at 27% November of 2018, and it was at 21% in November of this year. The low was in 2022 at 16%. And the news media is at 10%. So if you look at those, you see how the military is doing the best. I think the only institution that perhaps comes second, but there's a significant distance, was with police and law enforcement. And in November 2018, Rachel was 50%. And now, in our most recent surveys, at 34%. And, it's one of those things where that's an area of work. And it's quite disappointing from police and law enforcement to the military that, at least in the military's case, barely a majority of the American people have that trust and confidence. And that's something from a trend standpoint we'll continue to look at, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this decline in confidence in the military definitely comes in the context of that broader institutional loss of confidence across institutions. Military is still at the top of the list. There's something to celebrate there. But it's also been interesting to kind of really unpack the way that these institutions differ from each other, right? Like, for example, the American people's view of the presidency, the White House, even to a lesser extent, the courts sometimes seems to sort of fall upon a partisan basis, right? If your guy's in the White House or your gal's in the White House, you tend to have a higher view of the presidency than if the other guy's in the White House. With the military, what we saw was that it was a precipitous decline among both Republicans and Democrats over time. And so over the same period of time, I should say. And so that was interesting for us to watch. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, the way that it's sort of bottomed out in more recent years and then started to tick up has been really, really important to watch too. And I think that's something we'll unpack in future surveys.
Yeah, and more broadly, you talk about other institutions. You get polling on that pretty regularly, but kind of the focus on the military. There isn't a whole lot, right? There's not a lot out there. Another area where we're kind of seeing, kind of putting the military in context of other priorities outside of the national security and foreign policy space is on spending priorities. And this is one that we've asked consistently. Our institute are big promoters of investment in national defense. It's a constitutional responsibility captured there for the Congress to raise and support Article 1, Section 8. Certainly, the president in his or her role as commander in chief. I mean, these are core federal responsibilities, and that goes, certainly what contributed to President Reagan's point of view in terms of having a strong military and realizing peace through strength. How do the American people kind of rank military spending, and how does it rack and stack with other areas of spending that Americans care about, from border security to healthcare, Social Security, those entitlements that Americans have come to depend on and expect their government to deliver?
Yeah, there's kind of two aspects to this question, right? The support or disapproval for increasing military spending overall, and then that racking and stacking issue that you raised, which of course is all important in a environment where we simply don't have unlimited resources. In a vacuum, when we ask people about support for increasing defense spending or cutting the defense budget, a supermajority, and I should say a bipartisan supermajority of Americans support spending more money on our national defense. That's important to recognize. It's been consistent over time. In the 70s, nearly 3/4 of Americans year after year support increasing military.
It's 75% in November 2018. Lowest was 71% in June of 2023, and in November of 2024, it was the highest we've had. It was 79%. Yeah.
And I think those numbers, are important to look at kind of in an isolated way, and then putting it in the context that you mentioned, racking and stacking with other spending priorities is important as well. And that's where we see the military defense spending kind of falling lower on the list. I'd say it's consistently in the top 3 or 5 spending priorities. The way that it stacks up with border security in particular, some of our recent polling has shown that even among Republicans, defense spending ranks higher than border security spending, which is maybe not something you'd expect from watching kind of campaign trail rhetoric on that side of the aisle. But some of those other spending priorities, whether it's on the domestic side, border security, et cetera, do tend to kind of be in that mix sometimes, edging out military spending in terms of priorities.
We asked a question this year, you and I, when we have a chance to shape this with our colleagues at the Reagan Institute, it's probably worth giving a shout out to one Thomas Kenna, right? Polling Reagan National Defense Survey expert, and helps shape and organize and process the data so well for us at the Reagan Institute. We have obviously have fun with this, and it allows us to pursue some curiosity. One we threw in this year was kind of getting the view of kind of from those surveyed, how much they actually think we spend on national defense as a percentage of the federal budget. Just kind of curious what the perception is, whether people have an outsized sense or perhaps a modest sense compared to what the reality is. What do we find there?
People have an outsized sense of how much we spend on our national defense. And I think that makes it even more interesting that there's still 75% of the American people that want to spend more. But yeah, I think it's well over half of the American people who think that we spend far more than we do on our military budget when we just ask them to kind of estimate.
Yeah, 32% think we spend 26 to 50% of our budget on that. And here we're talking about all spending. We're not talking, we're not getting into the particulars of discretionary spending versus mandatory spending. This would include all the entitlement stuff. And the baseline for that is south of 18%. Is the answer, is the correct answer here. It's an objective answer. And you have 32% saying, hey, it's north of 26% all the way up to 50%. 16% of those surveyed think, I think it's someplace between 51% and 75%. And then shockingly, I'm not sure what to do with the 5% of the respondents who think we spend anywhere between 76 and 100% of our budget on on defense, on national defense. That was, I don't know what you do with that 5%, but they definitely need to see what the real reality is. And that's one to watch because clearly the assumptions, this is one I thought of, Rachel. You often are briefing members of Congress, other officials, and on all defense and national security related issues. But this is one where the American people need to be educated, right? That it's a lot of money we spend on national defense, but it's certainly not 50% of our budget.
I think that's right. I mean, there's an element in this poll, and as you say, when we brief it out to policymakers, particularly members of Congress, where we're taking stats up there about where their constituents are, and I think there's a real kind of action item on their end, as well as sort of leaders on the commentariat side in Washington and beyond around. Well, let's do some of the work to educate and explain, whether it's facts like on defense spending, as you point out, or persuade on some other issues where maybe as we talked about earlier, some of these views are out of step with where our worldview and our approach might want to see.
One more that we introduced that I think is adding to complexity and richness of the survey is getting the views of the American people in terms of trade-offs. So national defense spending versus national debt. And of course, this year is the first in recent memory where we've spending more on our servicing our national debt than we are in national defense. Tell us about those few questions.
Yeah, the bottom line on those questions is clear that as much as the American people care about fiscal responsibility and want to see us get our fiscal house in order, they don't want to balance the budget or reduce the federal deficit and debt on the back of the military budget or at the expense of our national security. When we put those things head to head in a poll, most Americans say no. They say, we care about the debt, we care about the military budget. We don't want to address debt and deficit at the expense of that defense budget.
And this is an interesting one where you referenced this earlier in the conversation where, if you give a little more information, we'll ask the question again and see if and how it moves people. We then gave information saying, hey, actually, we do spend more servicing the national debt than on national defense. Does that change your view? I'm not quoting the question exactly, but that was effectively, we asked, hey, do you have a different, or how concerned are you knowing this now? And it moved people by, a statistically significant way, from 69% being concerned to 77%. And it wasn't people who were somewhat concerned to being extremely concerned, right? Actually, it moved people who were not very concerned to now, this is a problem.
Right. And that element of message testing that we're able to explore in our poll too, I think helps aid those policymakers and opinion leaders as they do that work of educating and explaining or persuading to advance, things like peace through strength, investing in our military. We can kind of see which arguments are effective in moving people from yes to no or no to yes, and really persuading public opinion along the way. One of the real, I think, valuable things that comes out of this survey.
I want to jump in a moment to some of the hotspots around the world and how we address them in the survey. But before we go there, I'm going to go to one of my favorites, which gets to perhaps an early indicator that the American people, broadly speaking, really do want leadership in the world. They're not falling for the sort of thing that leadership in the world and a strong military translates into forever wars. Nobody wants a forever war, and nobody wants to have policies that bring us to that. But there are some who think, hey, if you have a strong military, if you do have military overseas presence, somehow that's is a manifestation of forever wars or lead to that. That's certainly not the view of the American people consistently year over year. All right, so talk about my favorite question that we deal with since we started the survey together in 2018.
Our listeners will not be surprised to hear, if they've listened to the podcast even once before, that Roger's favorite question
That's right.
Is around that global military presence question. We ask the American people not just, how much should we spend on the military and all of that, but what should we do with the military? And one way that we do that is should we maintain our global military base presence, or should we close those bases and bring them home and just react to things as they happen? Whereas, of course, the presence of military bases around the world allows us to deter attack and be there in case of contingency. Over 2/3 of the American people every year we've done the survey have said that they want to maintain our global military base presence. And I like this question a lot too, because it really, we ask broad questions about American leadership in the world and engagement, and those things, those words can mean different things to different people. And so this is a question where we get much more granular and really put a real world scenario. Should we keep these bases or should we close them and bring the troops home? And separate it from that forever wars conversation that you're talking about, but also just really get a sense of where the American people are when it comes to how they want to use the military to achieve that peace through strength posture that we support.
To me, it translates that they understand that, one, our military is a force for good. Two, there's a relationship between forward presence of our military and peace and prosperity. The sorts of things that have made this country so great, certainly since the end of World War II. Fantastic economy, the opportunity, no war, kind of, in the sense of at the scale of the Second World War. There are policy decisions that sought to deliver that outcome, and our forward presence and global posture. Those are fancy inside the beltway words, but at the end of the day, these are things that allow Americans, to live at peace at home. Let's go to another important one that is helpful for contextualizing. We look at these hotspots and challenges, foreign policy and national security challenges around the world, which is who are allies and who are our enemies. So let's start with the adversaries, the enemies. Who's the winner this year? Who's top of the list? And again, we've been asking this question since 2018.
Well, China's top of the list this year for several years running. When we ask
you got to change your China pronunciation these days. We're right here at the moment of inauguration. You're not going to do China. There we got. What do we got?
I'm not gonna attempt an impersonation.
Okay.
I know better. When we ask people which country poses the greatest threat to the United States, China's been at the top of the list, frankly, among both Republicans and Democrats for several years now. When we started asking this question in 2018, Russia was actually at the top of the list. China was number 2 and a distant second, I should note. And it's just been a huge sea change in public opinion. We ask the allies and adversaries question in a different way as well, which is we run down a list of countries from China and Russia to friends and allies around the world, and just ask if people perceive them as an ally or an adversary. This is an area that kind of gets at some of what you and I were talking about earlier as well, where maybe the results of the survey are kind of at odds with the way that national security leaders in Washington might see an issue. I remember when you and I were first briefing out the first survey on Capitol Hill in 2019, nearly 50% of the American people saw China as an ally or something of an ally. And the way that those numbers have changed in just a few short years to really bring the bipartisan consensus of the country to where bipartisan consensus in Washington had been for a few years prior has just been remarkable to be able to track year on year in the survey.
And we did see a bump. You might want to hit on Russia here, certainly after Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. When we did the survey some months later in November of 2022, we saw a bit of a spike. Went up to about 31%.
Yeah, it did spike after the invasion of Ukraine. It was still second on the list behind China, but a big spike there, and it's been a little bit higher than it had prior ever since.
So talk about friends in particular here, maybe worthwhile. Certainly United Kingdom, you would expect would be top of the list, but some of the others, particularly because they've been in headlines, Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan.
Yeah, those countries that are kind of either in the headlines for global hotspots, or where there's really tension and questions about U.S. Commitments and resolve, frankly, are ones that we've been watching closely, and it's been amazing to see um, really the consensus bipartisan majority support around those countries, even despite questions about what the U.S. should do to support in those conflicts, or deter potential future conflict in places like Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. But in all three of those cases, we see around 3/4 of the American people who perceive those countries to be, I should say, in different cases, 2/3 to 3/4, which are, as anyone who follows polling will tell you, if you can get 2/3 of the American people to agree on anything, that's a good day.
Yeah.
So we see about 2/3 to 3/4 of the American people considering those countries to be allies and friends of the United States, and in the alternative, even more in the 80s and up near 90% of Americans who perceive countries like China and Russia to be adversaries.
Yeah, and the Israel is one that stood out to me just because I was curious with all the protests in the United States in response to Israel's response to the October 7th Hamas attack, seeing if there was any dip. In fact, it was at 72%, seeing Israel as an ally. Its lowest in the years we've done it was the 66% in November 2021, and I guess highest was when we started in November 2018 at 80%. But Israel's kind of doing as well as, I don't know, Japan roughly, and much better than India, right? So it's kind of contextualizing it that way. And Ukraine, as you noted, is done quite well and increased over the number of years. Certainly during the Biden administration, you've seen that. Why don't we talk now just in terms of policies that we ask questions on as it relates to Ukraine and what the U.S. role should be in supporting Ukraine, if at all, and then similarly with Israel, and there are important partisan differences, as you referenced before.
Yeah, this is, I think, where we start to see some of that partisan division coming out in inverse ways when it comes to Ukraine and Israel. In both cases, I should note, though, it is a bipartisan majority of Americans who want to, the way we phrase the question often, provide U.S. support or send U.S. weapons to each of those countries. In the case of Ukraine, Republicans are slightly below that national average, and in the case of Israel, Republicans are above that national average. So we see Republicans and Democrats taking slightly different paths there, but it is still true to say that in our polling, most Republicans support sending U.S. weapons to Ukraine, and most Democrats support U.S. military aid to Israel. And those numbers have been more consistent over time than you might think, given the debate that we've all listened to.
Now, just going to harp on the Israel piece, because we added questions to really get at the decline in Democratic support for Israel. And by that is Democratic voters, Harris voters. Maybe worthwhile just to focus on that for a minute, because we give a few options. Like, you support Israel by providing defensive and offensive weapons, and then you can support Israel by just giving defensive weapons, because some of the policy discussions in Washington hit on that. Joe Biden, would give missile defense to Israel, for example, but 2,000-pound bombs, at least for a time, the United States was not delivering to Israel. But in terms of the voter, the respondents, the distinction between offensive and defensive weapons really didn't seem to matter. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's where sometimes what we learn in this polling is some of those finer points and distinctions and nuance are not really breaking through, and there does seem to be sort of a more general sense that people want to support Israel, but when we look at kind of those distinctions that mean a lot to policymakers for good reason, who are on the hook for a lot of these decisions, you don't see as much distinction as you might expect in the public opinion data.
Last one. There's so much more in the survey, so I encourage all our listeners and viewers to look up the Reagan National Defense Survey. Put it in your browser. The November 2024 survey should pop up. Explore it. Take a look. Of course, we're wrapping up here a Reaganism podcast with our own Rachel Hoff, policy director at the Reagan Institute. One other item that I think is worth commenting on. It's almost a flip side in some respects of the Israel discussion we're just having, which is Iran. Tell us about the views of the American people as it relates to policy towards Iran. We're on the cusp of the second Trump administration. A clear fundamental policy difference is between the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration in terms of not only how they view Iran, but policies towards Iran. And that I'm talking about maximum pressure, which you'd see from, anticipate seeing from the Trump administration, whereas the Biden administration, in my mind, shockingly, really never adjusted its policy towards Iran, even after October 7th, and seeing how their proxies wreaked havoc on Israel and on the United States. Think about our presence in the Red Sea and what the Houthis have been up to, and the targeting of U.S. military forces in Syria and Iraq. All this seemed not to change the Biden administration's approach towards Tehran itself. What did our survey show there, Rachel?
Yeah, it seems to have really informed, on the other hand, the way that the American people are perceiving these issues and Iran's influence. Americans see Iran as an adversary. They want the U.S. to be active in the region in countering Iranian influence, in countering their nuclear program, in countering their terror proxies throughout the region. And one question that we had that I think is informative, especially in this moment of transition into the Trump administration, is we asked, compared to the Biden administration, do you want the next administration to take a more aggressive or less aggressive approach on Iran? And it was a majority of Americans who want to see a more aggressive approach. And so it's going to be really interesting to see what the Trump administration
59% of Trump voters, but only 29% of Harris voters, I think, wanted that. So it really does track as you stated. All right, we're going to wrap up here. Rachel, as you know, because you've sat where I sit now, and you do that episodically. I'm sure there are listeners and viewers wish you would do it more. I'm one of those people. Give us your take on our lightning round. Maybe I'm putting you on the spot here. I'm not sure we prepped for this, but you've certainly heard enough that you could answer one on the fly. Favorite Reagan speech, book, quote. What do you got?
Well, if I didn't prepare for the lightning round, then I wouldn't be a very good sometimes guest host of the Reaganism podcast. I'm going to do all three, but I'm going to do them quickly. They've been given before, but I just want to lay down my votes. My favorite book.
Weighted vote, by the way, with you. This is weighted, given your role.
Fair enough. My favorite book is Dr. Will Inboden's The Peacemaker. He was a great professor and mentor of mine in graduate school at the University of Texas when he started working on that book. And so certainly have appreciated.
Somewhere in Texas, Will Inboden's smiling right now. That's a good one.
Someone in Florida now.
Florida, of course.
For speech, you'll not be surprised to hear that President Reagan's Westminster address, which informs so much of our work here at the Reagan Institute around our Center for Freedom and Democracy and the work we do on global dissidence. And for quote, in line with that programming that I'm really privileged to lead as well, I'll give you President Reagan's "Freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the universal and inherent right of all human beings."
Perfectly stated, well executed lightning round, an example for all future guests of Reaganism. Rachel Hoff, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.